Starting our bulletin with Thailand, as Thai pro-democracy protesters gathered in Bangkok again for the 8th consecutive day of protests and demonstrations, Thailand's embattled Prime Minister has revoked emergency measures after a week of protests. Now, the emergency decree was announced last week, banning gatherings of more than 4 people. This after the decree failed to stifle a growing protest movement demanding his resignation and reforms to the monarchy.
ผมกำลังเตรียมที่ยกเลิกพรก.สถานการณ์ฉุกเฉินที่มีความร้ายแรงในเขตท้องที่กรุงเทพเร็วๆนี้ยกเว้นหากมีสถานการณ์รุนแรงใดๆเกิดขึ้น
On the 8th day of protest, thousands of angry democracy activists marched on the government house defying the emergency decree. Now, Thai protesters also gave Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-ocha a 3-day deadline to step down or face more demonstrations. But the leader who made the announcement was arrested within 2 hours. Many of their top leaders have already been detained under the state of emergency that banned public gatherings of more than 4 people. These protesters scheduled demonstrations not just in the capital but also at several other locations around the country. The student protesters have been calling for limitations on the power of the monarchy and the resignation of Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-ocha. Now, police have failed to confront the protesters directly. Instead, Thailand police are now trying to disrupt the gatherings by selective shutdowns of mass transit and seeking to block their online organizing activities. Now, for the latest on this, we are now being joined live by Matthias Peer, who is a correspondent based in Bangkok. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, protests have continued, as you know, despite a ban on public gathering, and pressure is, of course, mounting on Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-ocha. In fact, now a deadline has been given and a mock resignation as well. How do you assess these developments?
Yeah, the fact that the government just revoked the emergency decree about half an hour ago means that the government is trying to at least present themselves as the side that is trying to de-escalate. Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-ocha wants to give the impression that he is trying to reach out to the protesters, and so revoking the emergency decree now means that the ban on public gatherings is now lifted. That means that legal protests can now continue on the streets. This is certainly a win for the protesters, but it was not their main demands. Their main demands still exist. They want the Prime Minister to resign, they want a new constitution, and they want reforms of the monarchy, and all this is still in place, and we haven't seen any indication that the government is willing to give in on those demands. So we might expect further confrontation here.
Yes, I was actually going to come to that. As you mentioned, the emergency decree has been lifted, but how effective do you think this will prove to be?
Yeah, so far, as you said, the demonstrators, they have given Mr. Prayut a 3-day deadline to resign. Yesterday, they even handed over a pre-written resignation statement that they say he just needed to sign, and this situation would be resolved for them. Yeah, obviously, he's not willing to do that. He's not willing to step down so far. So the protesters, they already said they are going to continue their activities on the streets in Bangkok. Probably also, yeah, after this ultimatum will expire on the weekend. The Prime Minister himself, he urged them to trust in the parliamentary process. There will be an extraordinary session of the parliament next week, and the parliament will discuss those issues. They also want to discuss a reform of the constitution, but it remains to be seen if that is enough to satisfy the protesters. I highly doubt that.
All right. And do you think this is likely that this has paved way for some reform or answering calls to reform given the growing unrest in Thailand?
So the government seems to be keen to, at least de-escalate the situation a little bit. So it is quite possible that they might give in smaller parts of the demands. But the main demands, for example, reform of the monarchy, it's such a sensitive topic here in Thailand, and it used to be such a big taboo. This taboo has been broken by the activists. They are now actively discussing the monarchy and the role of the king in Thailand. And it is really hard to see a compromise there, because this is something the government really doesn't want to do. They don't wants to reform in these kinds of topics. So really hard to estimate where this will go. I don't think the protesters will give in so easily, and certainly the government also won't do that.
All right, Matthias, thank you so much for joining us with all those details. We will continue to track this closely.